Hello, and welcome to this explainer on Ch4 from Assessment for Language Teaching by EP5 and Constant Leung. Now, if you're a language teacher, a TESOL professional, or a researcher, you already know that assessment is about so much more than just handing out grades. It is fundamentally about purpose. Today, we're going to keep things calm, academic, yet incredibly practical, as we unpack the core types of language assessment. So, let's dive right in. To give you a clear cognitive map for where we're headed today, here are our three big takeaways. First, we are going to look at the interconnectedness of formative assessment and summative assessment. Spoiler alert, they aren't isolated islands. Second, we'll explore how to apply assessment of learning right alongside external standards. And third, we're going to contrast two major decision-making frameworks, the Norm Referenced Approach, or NRA, and the Criterion Referenced Approach, or CRA. Here is our quick game plan for today. We'll cover formative and summative assessment, move into assessment of learning, touch on standards-based assessment, explore making assessment decisions, and wrap up with a critical reflection. Let's jump right into Section 1, Formative and Summative Assessment. Getting a solid grip on these foundational concepts is absolutely essential for building your language assessment literacy. Let's start with the core definition of formative assessment, commonly called FA. Basically, it's all about collecting evidence of a student's learning and engagement, specifically to improve both learning and teaching. Think about this from the perspective of a postgraduate TESOL student developing your own assessment literacy. As a learner, FA is the feedback loop that tells you if you're actually grasping the material. For the teacher, this is happening dynamically, right there in the classroom. You're asking questions, you're checking for understanding, and you're adjusting your lesson on the fly. The ultimate purpose here? It's pure support and growth. Then, on the flip side, we have summative assessment, or SA. This involves gathering evidence of students' performances and judging them against pre-established learning outcomes, standards, or benchmarks. Now, you might be wondering, where exactly is the boundary between FA and SA? Well, SA is really about cumulative evidence. Its core purpose is to look backward at what has been achieved, and it's usually collected at the very end of a learning period. Think of a final exam or an end-of-term project. If we zoom out and look at the broad ecosystem we operate in, testing and assessment are guided fundamentally by learning goals and performance standards. This is where purpose really takes center stage. Before we even design an assessment, we have to ask ourselves, what is our purpose? What are the actual learning outcomes we want to see? Literally, everything flows downward from those overarching goals.
But here's the really interesting part. Formative and summative assessments aren't exact opposites. They're actually an interconnected network within this classroom ecosystem. Imagine you're an early career language teacher, and you give a midterm exam. Now, traditionally, that's a classic summative assessment, right? But what if you take those midterm results and use them to pinpoint exactly where your students are struggling, just so you can review those tricky topics next week? Well, you've just used a summative assessment for a totally formative purpose. You've taken that data and fed it directly back into the learning loop.
All right, moving on to Section 2, Assessment of Learning. So if you're looking for a really concrete definition of assessment of learning, or AOL, it is essentially synonymous with summative assessment. We're talking about things like formal quizzes, achievement tests, and those big midterm and final examinations. The specific driving purpose of AOL is accountability. It provides a formal, official record of student learning, which is exactly what ends up on academic transcripts and institutional certificates. Because of that accountability, there's a crucial requirement here: alignment. The text emphasizes this as an absolute necessity for high-quality classroom assessment. It works in 3 steps. Step 1, target learning outcomes. Step 2, teaching and learning activities. Step 3, assessment tasks. Let's say your target learning outcome is conversational fluency, but your teaching activities consist entirely of reading textbook dialogues, and your final assessment task is a multiple-choice grammar test. Well, your alignment is completely broken. To make equitable and valid decisions about a student's progress, those 3 steps must be tightly, logically connected. Let's shift gears slightly into Section 3, Standards-Based Assessment. Standards-based assessment includes things like university admission tests, state or national examinations, and major commercial language proficiency tests. These are typically external mandates that come with strictly observed administrative procedures. Every single test taker gets the same time limit, the same instructions, and is graded on the same scoring rubrics. And because their purpose is often extremely high stakes, these external tests heavily influence school curriculums and dictate a lot of what actually happens in the classroom.
To ground this, let's look at a practical scenario comparing ESL standards for English as an additional language or dialect students based on the Australian curriculum. Take a look at the clear difference between the emerging phase and the developing phase. An emerging student can understand simple, short texts with varying success, mostly relying on familiar sounds and vocabulary. A developing student, however, has moved to a point where they can identify the main purpose of a text and read aloud with some fluency. As a teacher, you use these specific, standardized benchmarks to differentiate exactly where a student's ability currently lies. The whole purpose of these standards is to give you a reliable, shared metric for measuring student proficiency.
Next up is Section 4, Making Assessment Decisions. Okay, I know statistical terms can sometimes feel a bit dry or confusing, whether you're a brand new teacher or a seasoned researcher. So let's clearly contrast two very different approaches to making decisions with assessment data. On one side, we have the norm-referenced approach, or NRA. This is all about relative ranking based on percentiles. On the other side, we have the criterion-referenced approach, or CRA, which is about making absolute decisions based on benchmarks. Simply put, you are looking at relative ranking versus absolute matching. Let's break down the mechanics of the NRA first. The term norm comes from the normal distribution, which you probably know as the bell curve. NRA uses standard deviation to estimate the spread of scores and then ranks students relative to one another. Under this approach, you aren't just looking at what a single student knows, you're looking at how they performed compared to literally everyone else taking the test. The primary purpose of NRA is selection. Think of university admissions, where there are only a limited number of spots available and you absolutely need to identify the top percentiles. Conversely, the CRA is a whole different ballgame. It decides student achievement using given learning outcomes without ever comparing students to each other. Here, a student's performance is matched against absolute criteria or a predetermined minimum cut score. Think about it like this. If the cut score to pass is 70% and every single student in the room gets above 70%, guess what? Everyone passes. Their success doesn't depend on someone else failing to balance out a curve. I absolutely love the driving test analogy from the text to illustrate CRA. When you take a driving test, the licensing authority doesn't care if you are the absolute best driver on the road that day. They don't care if you're better than the guy who tested before you. They only care if your driving meets the minimum criteria for safety and vehicle control. It's an absolute yes or no decision based purely on the benchmark. This analogy perfectly captures the purpose of classroom-based summative assessments. We are checking for mastery, not ranking our students. Finally, let's move to Section 5, Critical Reflection. Let's pause for a second and ask a really critical question. Should assessment for and of learning in a typical classroom be norm-referenced? Why or why not? Think about the real-world challenges of using an NRA approach in your language classroom. If you grade your students on a strict bell curve, you are mathematically guaranteeing that a certain percentage of them will fail or get low grades, even if every single one of them actually mastered the material. Artificially penalizing students just for the sake of maintaining a curve totally undermines the very purpose of teaching in the first place, which is for everyone to successfully learn the target outcomes. All right, bringing this explainer full circle, let's lock in those three big takeaways for maximum retention. First, remember that formative and summative assessments aren't opposites. They're a unified, interconnected network in your classroom ecosystem. Second, assessment of learning demands strict alignment between your outcomes, your teaching activities, and your tasks. And third, always keep your purpose front and center. NRA is for relative selection, while CRA is for determining absolute mastery. To wrap this up, everything we've talked about today from Chapter 4 is geared toward building your language assessment literacy, or LAL. When you truly understand the underlying purpose of these different assessments, when you know exactly when to use a bell curve for selection and when to use a benchmark for mastery, you empower yourself to make equitable, deeply informed decisions for every single student. It is the foundation of creating a fair, supportive learning environment. So as you head back in your own classrooms or dive back into your research, I want to leave you with this question. Is your assessment genuinely measuring mastery, or is it secretly designed to sort and rank your students? The answer just might change the way you teach forever. Thanks so much for joining this explainer.